things. You had people like Jimi Hendrix, you had bands like Blue Cheer and Iron Butterfly and Led Zeppelin. The Kinks used distortion on their amplifiers on their You Really Got Me by actually cutting into the guitar or the amplifiers, because they didn't have, like Marshall hadn't started building Marshall amps yet. Those didn't come around until like the Who. So the very first distortion that you hear and actually there's even earlier rock and roll that has distorted guitar in it, but if you listen to the Kinks' You Really Got Me, that sound is from physically cutting the guitar, the amplifier cones. But metal, as a distinct thing separate from other just heavy rock, if it has a birthday, it's February 13th, 1970. That was the night that the first Black Sabbath album was released. And Black Sabbath are widely considered the very first metal band. Now, they formed as a blues rock band, influenced by a lot of these things I mentioned before. But an interesting accident happened. Tony Iommi, the guitar player for Black Sabbath, Black Sabbath originally formed with the name Earth, and like I said, they were a blues rock band. Tony Iommi worked in a sheet metal factory in Birmingham, England. Birmingham is the birthplace of metal, and it's an industrial, working class city. And he worked in the steel factory and was quitting his job because his band was starting to take off and he looked like he was going to have a promising career in music. And it was his last day at work. He went home from lunch and said, I'm going to go back. I'm done. And his mother said, no, finish what you start. Go back and finish your job. He went back after lunch, went to work, and they said, okay, the guy that runs the sheet metal cutter didn't show up today. So we're going to have you operate that machine. He'd never done this before. They gave him quick training on it. Putting the metal through, the machine comes down to cut or bend the metal. Cuts off the tips of two of the fingers on his fret hand. He's convinced that his guitar playing career is over. Until months later, he's recovering. Somebody takes him to see Django Reinhardt, the jazz guitar player who has a mangled hand, and he sees him play, and he's like, if he can teach himself to play guitar again, so can I. He fashions false fingertips by melting the tips off of dishwashing soap bottles and fashioning them around thimbles, and he makes fake fingertips to go over his fingers, and he's trying to learn to play guitar with that. But it's really painful, and he learns that it's actually easier for him to play this way if he downtunes the guitar. So he downtunes his guitar, and that creates the heavy metal sound that you think. So it was an industrial accident that it gave birth to heavy metal. Black Sabbath's first song was the song Black Sabbath, and that song evolved through Geezer Butler, the bass player, playing during a rehearsal. He was playing a bass line that was kind of inspired. He'd been listening to a lot of classical music, and he'd listened to Holst play the Mars theme from the Planets. And that dun, 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 is directly lifted out of Holst. And Tony heard him playing that, and they basically wrote this long, heavy song that didn't sound like anything else that had been happening in music at the time. First time they played it live, they did it as the last song of their set. the response was so overwhelming that they had to play the same song 3 more times before the audience was satisfied. So, 1970, Friday, February the 13th, the first Black Sabbath album was released in England. Didn't come out in America until about a year later. It was critically panned, but it sold amazingly well. It went to number 8 in the British rock and pop charts, but the critics hated it. Music critics have never liked metal. That's kind of changed in recent years, but back in Lester Bangs, who's a genuinely really smart music critic, totally panned the first Black Sabbath album in Rolling Stone. But the kids liked it, and they bought the records. And that kept evolving. And metal really started in England. So the next big band after Black Sabbath is a few years later, also from Birmingham, Judas Priest came along. What Judas Priest brought were, Black Sabbath still had its roots in the blues rock. Judas Priest were the first band to kind of jettison all the blues influence and play a little faster, and be like kind of the first purely like self-identified, like we're a metal band. Black Sabbath didn't call themselves a heavy metal band. That was a name that got put on them later by writers and things. And Judas Priest embraced that term and said, yeah, that's what we're playing. They also brought the look of the leather and studs and things. We all know now that Rob Halford is out of the closet, but that was kind of more secretive at the time. But he went to like S&M club shops and he bought like all this S&M gear and wore it on stage, and kind of a mix of biker, S&M, leather spike, all these sorts of things, and denim. And it really did, you know, the kids that were buying these records just took it at face value as a tough guy thing, but Rob Halford kind of knew there was like this camp element in that. The other thing that Halford did was introduce the kind of soaring, high-pitched metal vocals. So you have like the really heavy, down-tuned guitar sound, and you need like something that will cut through that in the vocals. So Rob Halford had this kind of operatic way of singing, which became a big part of the British metal style of what later became the new wave of British heavy metal, which was a few years later. Basically, throughout the 70s, you had this melding of like metal and hard rock, kind of one and the same thing. Then in 1976 and 77, punk happens. Almost immediately, all the earlier hard rock and metal bands aren't cool anymore. And everything is about the Sex Pistols and the Damned and the Clash and all these British punk bands. But while that was going on, there was still this undercurrent of people who were like, wait, I actually want my musicians to know how to play. And so there was an underground movement of kind of returning to the Judas Priest style of heavy metal and things, which is what became known as the new wave of British heavy metal. One of the first bands to be considered, and they actually predate this term, but one of the first bands to be part of that and are very key to this whole story of extreme metal is Motorhead. Lemmy had been a roadie for Jimi Hendrix. He's like a lifer rock and roll guy. He had been in a band, a psychedelic rock band in England called Hawkwind, got fired from Hawkwind, he claims because he was on the wrong drugs. Because everybody else in Hawkwind was doing acid, and Lemmy was doing speed. And that's what the name Motorhead comes from. It was a slang name for a speed freak. So he gets kicked out of Hawkwind. The last song he wrote for Hawkwind is called Motorhead. He forms a new band called Motorhead. They're taking a lot of elements of heavy metal, playing it faster and more aggressively than had ever been played before. And Lemmy has this really gruff, kind of barky, kind of vocal style. So these are, like, metal is getting more extreme each like, throughout this history, there's just a constant desire to, like, push things further and become heavier, louder, rougher, whatever. And then there's reactions back against that, and melody is brought back in and things. The new wave of British heavy metal became this term for all, there were like thousands of these bands in England in the early 80s. The biggest one to come out of the scene was Iron Maiden. Very influenced by Judas Priest, the twin guitar sound, the soaring vocals of Bruce Dickinson, the denim, all that whole look. And that's where metal kind of matures into its own thing. It's kind of a separate thing from what had been kind of blues rock and hard rock before, like where metal develops, it matures into its own identity. And from there, it splinters off into all these tangents and things, which we're going to get into. The new wave of British heavy metal was a marketing term basically invented by the British music press. There was a paper in England called Sounds. And the thing that's great about England as a music scene is it's a relatively small country. It's like Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, part of Minnesota. It's like, that's the whole side, of England. So to be like a huge British band is like being like a regional band in the US. Like you don't have, you can, and there were like 4 or 5 of these weekly rock papers at the time. And they're all looking to develop the next big thing. So punk happens, the new wave of British heavy metal happens, all these things. It's like, it's constantly, these music journalists are always looking for something they can elevate up and then knock down later and say it's not cool anymore. And the kids buy these papers and these things become all these different trends very quickly. So the new wave of British heavy metal was a phrase that was used in one of these articles to describe these new bands. But what the new wave of British heavy metal did was take the aggression of metal, but bring in the speed that came from punk and from Motorhead and the faster Judas Priest and Iron Maiden songs, and it was kind of that energy. So, and it took the DIY kind of aesthetic of punk rock, but brought more technical musicianship to it. Most of these bands didn't go very far. Iron Maiden became huge. Def Leppard became big, but out only after kind of softening their sound and kind of making it in America. They were kind of very quickly rejected by most of the metal fans in England that were part of this new wave of British heavy metal scene. The next big thing, which I'm not going to really get into, that kind of kills the new wave of British heavy metal is glam rock in LA. It takes the heaviness of the new wave of British heavy metal and influences from like bands like the New York Dolls and T-Rex and that kind of glam metal scene. It's all about fashion, and it's that is where most people who think of metal from like the 80s, like MTV, those were the bands that were getting played heavily on MTV. But there was a reaction against that. The metal was getting too soft, too pretty, whatever. And you had, at the same time, a hardcore punk scene happening in America and the UK. Hardcore was taking the ideas of punk rock, but taking it to its further, like, what had been punk had kind of become new wave, and it was all like poppy songs with guys with skinny ties. Hardcore was much more aggressive. It was much more like purely, it took a lot of the ideas that punk espoused, but kind of actually treated it more seriously. It was very austere. Now, early on, like, I'm 53, and in the 80s was like my time of coming of age and like getting into music. And I was much more of a hardcore punk fan than I ever considered myself a metal fan at the time. Because I associated metal with all these glam rock bands, and I wasn't interested in that. I was like going to Black Flag shows and Dead Kennedys shows and things like that. But there were metal fans that were attracted to that scene and this new wave of British heavy metal scene. And in America, those two elements fused, and it created something called thrash. The biggest, the big four of thrash were Metallica, Slayer, Anthrax, and Megadeth.